Call this committee of the whole meeting of the Arlington Heights Village Board to order on Monday, September 9, 2019, and ask if you'd please rise and join the village board in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. For purposes of roll call, let me just introduce the board members who are with us tonight. To your right are Trustee Greg Padovani, Trustee Jim Tinaglia, Trustee Robin LaBedz, Trustee Bert Rosenberg, Trustee Mary Beth Canty, and Trustee Tom Schwingbeck. I'm Village President Tom Hayes. We've got a couple of items on the agenda tonight. The first is refining our Arlington Heights Affordable Housing Guidelines. So I'll turn it right over to Mr. Recklaus, our village manager.
Thank you, Mayor. Tonight, staff's going to be presenting a report on a potential update to the village's affordable housing guidelines. We recognize that this is a very important topic for our community. The village is one of only a small handful of communities in the Chicagoland area that have any formal program to encourage housing that is affordable. However, our current program provides only for guidelines for developers. It does not present a true policy that could be applied to all developments. This is a topic for which there are many misconceptions within our community, as we found in the recent dialogues, and we hope that in part, tonight's meeting will provide interested parties an opportunity to learn more about this topic as it relates to Arlington Heights. For that reason, the presentation will be televised for the benefit of residents who cannot attend this evening. The board will not be making any final decisions on this matter this evening. Based on the board's direction a few months back, staff wrote a report entitled Refining Arlington Heights Affordable Housing Guidelines. This report is available on the village's website as part of the meeting's agenda packet. The report went to the Village Board and Housing Commission last month. The report contains a series of broad recommendations for the Village Board's consideration. The staff recommendations seek to balance the need for affordable housing in our community with the recognition of the requirements of private developers so that we can encourage their continued investment here. The Housing Commission reviewed this report at their last two regular meetings. They have provided some alternative recommendations for the board's consideration. Tonight, staff will be presenting the findings of the report, including the Housing Commission's recommendations. We'll then look to the board to give whatever direction they see fit to give, whether it be to direct staff to further refine the recommendations or to research some other aspects of this issue. But with that, I'll turn things over to our Director of Planning and Community Development, Charles Witherington Perkins.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. I think to start with, Arlington Heights should be very proud of what it's accomplished over the years with respect to affordable housing. The village has been a recipient of the prestigious Daniel Burnham Award for its efforts in affordable housing as it relates to timber court development. So tonight, as the first step in trying to find that right balance in what our requirements should be without stifling residential development in the community, especially given the fact that very few communities in the Chicago metro area actually have codified required affordable housing guidelines. So Arlington Heights is one of just 6 out of the 284 communities in the northwest Chicago metro area. Before I turn it over to Nora Boyer, who's going to start the first part of the presentation, just want to point out on your dais is a copy of the presentation. On the bottom right-hand of each page is a page number. So at the end of the presentation, if you want to refer back and have us go back to a slide or page, we can certainly do that. So at the beginning, Nora's going to talk about what affordable housing is, how it's being applied in Arlington Heights, some of the overview of the research that we've done, and then I'll take over and talk about the survey that we did with developers in and around the area, and then go through each of the kind of overriding provisions and the recommendations. And then at the end, we do have a side-by-side comparison of staff's recommendation with the Housing Commission's recommendation, so you can kind of see how they compare, and that may be a good discussion point for the board after we have finished with our presentation. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Nora Boyer, who's our housing planner.
Thank you, Charles. We thought it would be best to start out by defining a couple of terms that we'll use throughout the presentation. The first question asked is, what is affordable housing? There is, of course, no universal definition for affordable housing, but there is a commonly used definition that's used at the federal, state, and local levels, which is affordable housing is housing occupied by low and moderate income households with a total cost that does not exceed 30% of their incomes, thereby leaving sufficient income to afford other necessities such as food, clothing, transportation, and medical care. So then the next question that would follow is then, what does low and moderate income mean? Again, there are different definitions of those terms. The ones that the village tends to use and many other municipalities use as well are the definitions that are used under the Community Development Block Grant Program. The village receives Community Development Block Grant money, and so we most often use the terms that are associated with that program. So under that program, extremely low income are households that have incomes at or below 30% of the area median income. Low income, excuse me, is households that have incomes at or below 60% of the area median income. And moderate income are households that have incomes at or below 80% of the area median income. So by area median income, what we're referring to again is federal standards that are updated annually. The chart that is on the screen now are the income levels for low and moderate income. So again, the 60% and 80% of area median income, adjusted by household size for the Chicago, Joliet, Naperville metro area. And of course, Arlington Heights falls within those within that metro area. So when we're talking about low and moderate income households in the village of Arlington Heights, those are the income levels at the various household sizes that we would be talking about. This slide just shows an example of some wages for some various occupations. These would be people working full-time at these various occupations. So just to get an idea of the kind of work that people would be doing who would fit into those low and moderate income ranges. So then in Arlington Heights, as far as rents go, the mean rent for an apartment in Arlington Heights, and this would be for all apartments, regardless of size or number of bedrooms, is currently $1,260 a month. So at that definition of 30% of income used for housing cost, and in this case meaning rent, a household would need to earn $50,400 a year in order to be able to afford the mean rent in Arlington Heights. The number currently of households paying 30% of more of their income for their housing costs and who are renters are 2,811. So again, those are current Arlington Heights residents, an estimate of current Arlington Heights residents paying more than 30% of their income for rent. As far as owners go, there's a wide range, as I'm sure you're familiar, of value of ownership property in Arlington Heights, since we have a broad range of smaller, more modest condominiums to large homes. But the median owner-occupied home value in Arlington Heights is $340,300 a year. We've provided, again, the numbers of households in Arlington Heights who are homeowners who are paying more than 30% or more of their annual income for their housing costs. Those two numbers put together is 5,971. So the total number of households in Arlington Heights currently paying 30% or more of their income for their housing costs is 8,782, or about 28% of our population. Next, I'm briefly going to go over some highlights of the history of affordable housing programs in Arlington Heights. It all started with a joint study committee that put together a report in 1972. That one of the recommendations in that report was the formation of the Housing Commission. which is when there started to be a lot of attention towards this concern in the village. In the 1970s and 80s, there were 3 subsidized affordable housing buildings or complexes constructed. Those would be the Gedke Apartments, Cedar Village, and Linden Place. And then there were also a number of apartment buildings that were required to have affordable units because they received industrial revenue bond funding. One of those was Dutton Tower, and I think you received a communication recently that their requirement has expired, as have, I believe, all of those buildings at this point. In the late 1970s, this was the beginning of the Community Development Block Grant Program, and the village began to participate. We've had a number of different programs using those funds. Then in 1998, the village board adopted the multifamily affordable housing policy, and this began the process of evaluating new construction planned unit development residential projects and starting to inquire about how those developments are meeting the village's affordable housing goals, which subsequently led to, in 2006, sort of the beginning of the formalizing the affordable housing guidelines that have then been applied to the new construction projects since then. The state of Illinois, in the meantime, passed the Affordable Housing Planning and Appeal Act. Some people refer to this as the 10% law. This is the law that requires that municipalities in the state of Illinois have at least 10% of their housing stock as affordable, or they are required to have an affordable housing plan to reach that goal, and they also may become subject to the State Affordable Housing Appeals Board. In 2013, the calculation used by the Illinois Housing Development Authority calculated that Arlington Heights affordable housing level was 13.1%. In 2018, it increased to 19.1%. The reasons for that we believe, is that there has been an increase in the median household income during that time, and also the decrease in the mortgage interest rates. I do want to point out that this is just one measure of what the percentage of affordable housing would be. One of the issues with the way the state calculates the percentage of affordable housing is that they don't include association dues as housing costs. It's just not in the formula. So when you have a community like ours where a good part of the affordable housing may be lower cost condominiums, more of those may appear to be affordable under this formula than actually are, because it doesn't take into account those association dues. So as we began to formalize our requests to have affordable units included in developments, I just wanted to point out the requirements as they originally were in 2008. There were more categories in terms of size, with a cap or at the upper end, a 20% affordability requirement. There were a couple of changes made in between then and now to decrease the percentages of affordable housing that are required, and also decreasing the fee in lieu from $100,000 per unit to $75,000 per unit. This slide shows how the affordable housing guidelines have been applied to the various new construction projects that we've had since we began implementing this program. The first of the projects was Timber Court Condominiums in 2005, which fully complied with the requirements by providing 20% affordable units. Unfortunately, it was right after that the decline in the housing market occurred, and there was a decrease in the amount of proposals that were coming in and construction that was taking place. You can see, starting with the Arbor Lane townhomes and going down actually through 4 North Hickory, there has been an increase over time in what has been asked of and received from developers during that time. During that time, though, as far as private developments were concerned, They all participate in the program by paying fees in lieu of providing units, with the exception of Parkview Apartments in Harts Place, where those are primarily affordable housing buildings constructed by developers who specialize in that. Starting with Arlington Downs 2, there came to be more support for the policy. I think understanding from the public in the importance of affordable housing in the community. So starting with Arlington Downs 2, Arlington 425, and Sigwalt 16, then there was a kind of an increase of, in 2 cases, actual affordable housing units included in the developments. And in the case of Sigwalt 16, there was a full compliance with the fee in lieu at $75,000 per unit. This chart shows the other Arlington Heights and the other suburban communities in the Chicago area that have written policies of this kind of program. You can see that Arlington Heights has sort of falls in the middle of the other communities. Its requirements are higher or require more than St. Charles, even Evanston and Oak Park, but require fewer units than Lake Forest and Highland Park. I would point out that Lake Forest and Highland Park, although they have the higher percentage of affordable units, also have policies on providing cost offsets to compensate for the higher percentages. In 2013, the village created the Arlington Heights Affordable Housing Trust Fund. The sources of the trust fund are listed there. The largest source of funding into the trust fund to date has been the payment of those fee in lieu amounts from the developers. Those are coming in slowly but gradually, and in increasing numbers in the future. According to the ordinance, the purpose of the trust fund is to create and preserve affordable housing, and it might be programs that involve new construction, rehabilitation, or adaptive reuse. The Housing Commission discusses the trust fund from time to time. It's been their desire to have that trust fund amount build up to a substantial amount because they want to do something substantial with it. There was a task force that worked on creating the trust fund, and then the Housing Commission as well had input that the ideal would be to use those funds to create permanently affordable units. So that might involve some kind of substantial investment, maybe matching funds working with a developer to get to that point. The trust fund currently has a balance of about $189,000. You can see the list of the fee in lieus that have been approved to date. Those fees are generally collected when permits are issued, so there's naturally a delay between when the project is approved and when the fees would be collected. Okay, and with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Charles, who is going to discuss some of the research as we've been undertaking it.
Thank you, Nora. So as we started looking at this issue after negotiating the last few agreements with various developers, we developed kind of a 5-step process. The first was to have discussions with market rate developers that build market rate housing in the community. So we had some phone calls, some face-to-face meetings. We sent emails with some additional information, and then after that we sent them a link to a survey. We did the same with non-profit affordable housing developers, as well as some of the owners and developers of senior housing in the community. So we did that same thing and then sent them a link to the survey. At the same time, we conducted research on other communities and nationwide. What are the trends? What are the issues? How are various communities, not just in our area, but throughout the country, managing and handling this? And then, as alluded to by Mr. Reckless, we prepared a detailed report called Refining the Arlington Heights Affordable Housing Guidelines. That report was issued in early August, and then the Housing Commission has held 2 meetings in August and in early September. So the survey that we sent, I'd like to walk through some of the results because they are important to keep in mind as we talk about this. So it was sent to 23 developers or for-profit and non-profit developers. 13 responses were received. About half of those, 6 of those responses were received from developers of affordable product, and the remainders were either non-profit or developers that are for-profit, but they focus solely on affordable housing and the senior developments that I referenced earlier. So the first question we asked is, how important is affordable housing to you? And 7 out of those 13 responded that it was very important. That is the results as a whole group. If we break out just the for-profit developers, 1 developer said it was very important. The others felt it was less important for their mission and their role of developing as a for-profit developer. That's not really surprising, but I did want to caveat that even though it's 7 up there, the for-profit developers have a slightly different view of it. It doesn't mean they don't want to participate, but they probably don't want to have it all on their backs, so to speak. The second question we asked were, what challenges does including units in your development represent? We asked them to rank that, with 1 being the highest. And the highest was the loss of revenue. So 7 out of the 13 indicated loss of revenue was the most important issue in providing units. Second was the ability to obtain financing, and then a third was the impact that the lost revenue may have on reselling their development at some point in the future. The next question we asked was, we're now getting into kind of getting their opinions on what do the developers think is an agreeable percentage to include actual units in their development. And here in this slide you can see 4 said 20% or more, but those are all non-profit or affordable housing developers. When we look at the market rate developers, they basically were saying between 5 and 10%. So 4 of the developers, 1 said 10% and 3 said 5%. And then the others had comments under none, and their comments were, 1 was a for sale product, and they suggested 1% of the final sale price of the unit. And another developer indicated that they didn't feel they could provide any. So that kind of gives you a breakdown on some of the responses there. We then asked if a lower percentage of units was required, would the developers be willing or interested in an annual reimbursement, not just a one-time fee from their gross revenues. This is done in other parts of the country. I visited a facility in Oakland, California. Obviously, California has a strong mandate for affordable housing. So they not only get units, but then they also get a percentage of the gross rents. Not surprising, the vast majority, 6, were not interested in that. I think that would probably be a very difficult thing to implement at this time in Illinois or in Arlington Heights, but we did want to get their opinion on that. We then asked if a fee in lieu of providing actual units was allowed, what would be an acceptable amount per unit, and this really had quite a range. So ranging from $25,000 to $100,000. One non-profit developer felt $100,000. But when we look at just the for-profit developers only, there were 2 that responded $25,000 was an appropriate fee. 1 responded $50,000, and 1 responded $75,000. So that's a little higher than we might have envisioned going into this survey. Under the other comments, 1 developer indicated $10,000 would be an appropriate fee, and then 1 for-sale developer indicated 1% of the sale price. So it seems that even the for-profit developers have indicated a willingness to contribute to the need of affordable housing, but have various opinions on that. We then asked, does having higher densities help provide attainable housing or affordable housing? Not a surprise here. A vast majority indicated that high densities would help them in their bottom line. I do want to caveat Arlington Heights has fairly high densities now as it is in comparison to at least our immediate adjacent communities. Maybe not as high as Evanston, for example, but we certainly have higher than many. So when we talk about density increases, we have to be careful at the appropriate locations. We then asked them what type of incentives would be most meaningful to them in an effort to try to provide more affordable housing in their development. The highest incentive responded by the developers was a fee reduction. So there's a reduction in permit fees when they pull a building permit, for example. Second, followed up by that was the follow-on from the previous slide as density bonuses. And then reduction in parking and or granting of variations were ranked pretty highly by the development community. We also asked them what they believe is the best way to reduce rents and provide some affordable units within the development. The highest ranking one here is some form of government incentives, which some other communities do. That was followed up by lower land values and higher rents in the other units within the development. None wanted to see lower profits for the developers. So after going through the survey and taking those results into account, and also the research on other communities, as you've noted in the report, we'd identified some kind of overreaching areas, trying to make some recommendations on certain areas, get some feedback from the Housing Commission, the board, and then based upon the feedback we get tonight, we'll draft obviously details that go along with this. So this is not by any means meant to be final discussion or final decision on any of these points. So we talk about what are the covered projects that the affordable guidelines or ordinance, if the board goes that way, what should it cover? Currently, our guidelines only apply to new construction and new construction that require a PUD or some kind of zoning approval. If there's new construction that complies with code and meets code and has no zoning actions, they're not covered by this. So that is a bit of a loophole. So you could have a 3 or 5 or 10 unit townhouse that has no zoning actions, and so they're not obliged to comply with this. And then you could have the same size development that needs a PUD or a variation and would be required to meet some form of standard that we've negotiated. So after looking at the various options, which I won't repeat, but they're in the report, both staff and the Housing Commission concurred in the recommendation to apply only to new construction for multifamily rental and for sale developments using a tiered approach at this time, which I'll talk about later. However, if the board chose to do an ordinance, it'd be fairly easy to write that ordinance that covered same new development, even if it didn't need a PUD or a zoning variation. So I just want to point that out. And then the second part of that recommendation is continue to research after this is finalized, expanding this to other areas, in particular adaptive reuse of other buildings. So for example, we had a case about a year ago, somebody was looking at converting an office building into residential. They wouldn't have needed any variations. It would have been 60 or 70 units if they'd moved forward. They wouldn't have fallen under this program. So the second step, we might want to start looking at some of those things. We then looked at the development size, and Nora kind of showed you how we compare with other communities. Currently, we have like a 3-tier approach. 5 or less, there's no requirement. 6 to 25 is 10%, and 25 plus is 15%. Staff has recommended staying with the 5 or less, not having to provide units or a fee, but we have suggested looking at a small or modest linkage fee, so that every new unit pays some modest amount that would then go into the trust fund, and then those fees would be linked to a CPI and adjusted on an annual basis, so we don't get 5 or 10 years down the road and the fee is kind of out of date. And then we have recommended 6 or more units require a fee using a tiered approach that I will get to in a moment. So the Housing Commission talked about that at length, and they've recommended slightly different in that it only applied to 10 or more units, so 9 or less would not need to comply. And they also agreed with the tiered approach for the 10 or more. So then we looked at, for rental product, what's the appropriate percentage, and I just went through the survey results. So generally, the requirement that we have for 26 or more units to have 15%, we found that to be unworkable. We've suggested that 15% requirement be eliminated. The Housing Commission concurred with that. We then looked at a tiered approach, and that's covered in the report, I think on pages 16 and 17. So it's a little condensed here, but we're looking at a tier 1 being downtown market rate development. It's close to transit, and we've looked at the model that we were able to negotiate with Arlington 425 here. So 7.5% affordable, with 5% units being included in the development and 2.5% at a fee of $25,000. If there's no fee, if there's no units provided for whatever reason, and that's agreed to by the board, then it would be 10% of the units at a $75,000 fee. And then tier 2 is market rate developments, community-wide. They're not downtown, but they are still market rate units. There's no type of public assistance, and we're suggesting 5% units be included in the development, given some of the survey feedback that we received. And then if units for various reasons are not included, then the fee would be 10% at $75,000 per unit. And then the third tier being developments community-wide, it could be downtown or elsewhere in the community, that have some type of public assistance, whether that's federal funds, low-income tax credits, or tax increment financing from the village, that they provide 10% actual units with no fee in lieu of option. Now, what that would mean would be for the village itself, in redevelopment areas where we have a TIF district, most likely a higher assistance to help offset that additional 5% of units provided in the development. The Housing Commission concurred with Tier 2 and 3, but they are recommending a higher percentage for the downtown market rate units. So instead of 7.5%, they're recommending 12.5%, and that 7.5% of those be actual units included in the development. With respect to owner-occupied units, staff and the Housing Commission concurred due to the market and how our experiences with Timber Court have panned out, not requiring actual units in for-sale product at this time, and that may change down the road in the future, but requiring 10% affordability of the units, but in a fee of $75,000 per unit. So similar to what we did at Sigwalt 16. The Housing Commission concurred with that, but have a modified recommendation to look at that fee based on the market rate of the unit. So for example, if a $300,000 price unit should pay a lower fee versus a $500,000 or $600,000 unit paying a higher fee. How those details would get worked out, how it would get administered, it becomes a little more cumbersome to do that, but that is their recommendation. We can certainly talk about that. Then income eligibility, these start to get somewhat a little easier. The recommendation here is to maintain the income eligibility for rental development at 60% AMI, and then further evaluate for sale product in the future if we start to require those units. Right now, our policy is 80% AMI in for sale product if units are actually provided, and 60% for the rental, and that is consistent That's 60% with the state affordable requirement. For us to maintain that 10%, it is at 60% of area median income. The term of affordability, we also looked at that, and there are communities that have a set term of years, whether that be 25 or 30 or 50 years. Our current requirement is that they be maintained in perpetuity. Staff continues to recommend that. The Housing Commission concurred with that, but they did recommend considering a term such as 50 years if more units were provided in a development. On its surface, that could be a good suggestion. However, based on our experience, for example, with Dunton Towers, that's about 35 plus years now, and now those units are gone, or potentially gone. So even 35 or 50 years, it does come around, and then those units are no longer available, and they're much harder to recreate down the road than they are the first time. So that would be just a bit of caution there. Local preference, we talked about that in the report. Currently, our guidelines don't allow or require local preference. They don't prohibit it. With Arlington Downs and Arlington 425, we did start developing local preference for Arlington Heights residents, employees of Arlington Heights businesses and organizations, and veterans. The Housing Commission concurred with that, and they also added an emphasis that Arlington Heights residents should be long-term residents to be defined, and then also added persons with disabilities. We also looked at developer cost offsets, so these are things like fee reductions, density bonuses, things of that nature, and the staff recommendation is to explore density bonuses carefully in certain districts and to evaluate a percentage fee reduction. So we did take a look at Parkview, the last building that had full fees that were paid. That's a 46-unit building. They paid about $46,000 in their building permit fee, so it was a little over $1,000 a unit in the actual fee. And then their impact fees for schools, parks, and libraries was about $3,500 per unit. Obviously, we can't waive those without seeking getting some kind of agreement from those other taxing bodies, but the village could, if it chose, waive some or a portion of the building permit fee. And then as we were doing the research, we came across Cook County. They have a Class 9 tax abatement program for developments that have 35% or more affordable units in them. That doesn't really help the developments that we're talking about because the percentage is too high. So the thought process here is if there was an agreement from the board, see if other communities that have affordable housing programs would support the village in talking to the county and trying to get a new class tax abatement program for developments that provide 5 or 10% affordable, and they get a proportional reduction. One of the overriding comments in the survey was real estate taxes on a per unit basis, and then lost revenue from lower rents would make providing more affordable units in a development cost prohibitive. That was the message we got from the developers. The Housing Commission concurred with most of these recommendations. They did recommend contacting the other taxing bodies about reducing impact fees. They didn't discuss the tax abatement issue at their hearing. We also looked at alternative developer contributions. These would be, for example, if a developer had another building or was willing to buy another building and maintain that in perpetuity as affordable. It is done in some other communities. We felt it could have some merit but it would have to be reviewed carefully on a case-by-case basis, and it would have to be made sure that like unit for unit was being provided. So that was the recommendation from staff. Housing Commission concurred. They got into a little more details on making sure it was in close proximity, and again emphasized making sure that it was, we were getting a like-for-like coverage in the alternative. And then coming towards the end, we talked about whether the policy should be in a guideline. Currently, it's in a guideline. It's a little more flexible. It's a little less predictable versus in an ordinance. So staff, really, we were looking for direction from the board and the Housing Commission on this as to whether keep it as an ordinance or keep it as a guideline or create an ordinance. If it was adopted as an ordinance, we believe there should be some type of relief mechanism in there to allow the board to provide relief on a case-by-case basis. And there should be periodic reviews of the guideline if it's in an ordinance or whether it's in a guideline. Either way, we feel that there should be periodic reviews of that, whether it's on an annual or biannual basis, depending on how often it was used. The Housing Commission generally kind of concurred with those recommendations as well. So in conclusion, just wanted to point out that it is extremely difficult to develop a specific set of standards that would fit all developments. It's unrealistic to expect that we wouldn't have any dialogue with developers and that we wouldn't have some negotiation on a case-by-case basis. All the communities that have ordinances and they're pretty firm on their ordinances, they're still discussed and negotiated on a case-by-case basis. However, we do feel a clearer, refined policy or ordinance would help in those discussions. So at this point, we are just seeking feedback from the Committee of the Whole, and we can go through the point-by-points, and then after that, we'd be looking for direction to go away, develop more specific criteria, and then bring a draft of a guideline or an ordinance back to the board. So at the end, I do have the each kind of major point with the staff recommendation and the Housing Commission recommendation. If the board wanted to go through that, or we can go back to any slides, and both Nora and Randy and I are happy to answer any questions.
Well, thanks, Charles and Nora, and to the Housing Commission for all the hard work that they've done in getting us to this point. Lots of numbers here, and they told us there'd be no math, but there is a lot of numbers to consider here, and it's all great work for the benefit of our community. I really like this end chart, the comparison chart, which really helps us focus on the differences. After hearing the arguments and rationale of the Housing Commission, I'm wondering if your staff recommendation has changed at all. Is there anything that we can come closer together in terms of what the staff recommendation was and the housing recommendations were?
Sure, I can go through them, and the major differences are just highlighted on this the next few slides. So the second one down, the application, I think if there were some modest linkage fee, we wouldn't really have an objection to starting at 9 or fewer and not being required to provide units. In reality, I suppose at 10% or 5%, the reality of getting a unit in a development less than 10 units is going to be very difficult. So we're looking more at a fee basis. So the question is, do you want a higher fee starting at 6 units or more, or a more modest fee from 9 and less? So we're flexible on that one, depending on the desire of the board. With respect to the tiered approach, the concern that I would have on increasing the downtown market rate development is we worked really hard to get to the point where we did with Arlington 425. I think unless our neighboring communities are doing something or there's a state mandate, the concern would be scaring off developers by making the fee too high. So I'm all for providing as much as we can. So that would be the concern that I would have on that particular one. With respect to the for sale units, we'd have to come up with a a formula that wasn't too complicated to try to address the Housing Commission's recommendation. In many respects, it makes a lot of sense that if you have a smaller priced unit, that the fee should be smaller. If you have a higher priced unit, it should be higher. How we get to that could be a bit challenging. In reality, we're not seeing a lot of new units being built in the 300,000 range anyway. So you would probably need to do a little more research and try to figure that one out a little bit. The term of affordability, we would recommend in perpetuity. And I don't think that eliminates at any time in the future a discussion on a term if something very unusual or unique came along. But I think the guideline, we would recommend that it stay in perpetuity, and then we just evaluate if somebody suggests something else. But I think the message would be that the unit should be maintained in perpetuity. With regards to the changes on local preference, we don't have any problems with that at all. We'll just work to define what long-term Arlington Heights resident would mean. So on the waivers, the parking requirement waiver in downtown, that's an interesting one. In Highland Park, I believe, they do that. They have a $15 residential permit fee for affordable unit owner or renters downtown. So long as we have available parking, that seems like it could be a good tool to use on a case-by-case basis for downtown development. Contacting other taxing bodies, that's probably a good idea to reach out and see their willingness to participate and help get additional affordable units in the community. And then the Housing Commission, they're recommending next main one, adoption as an ordinance, and staff we would agree with that as well.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just trying to narrow the field in terms of what we need to do tonight or in the future in terms of coming up with our own plan, formalized plan. And the village board could obviously modify what either of these, either the staff recommendation or the Housing Commission recommendation, and come up with their own recommendations. So with that, I'll turn it over to the board for questions or comments. Trustee LaBedz.
Thank you. I'd just like to ask a couple questions first. Can you explain what a linkage fee is?
Talk about that.
It would be a fee that we would set at a set amount per unit being developed, I'm sorry.
Charles referenced something about, or maybe it was you, Nora, the CPI, some kind of linkage with the CPI, but I didn't really understand it all as I was reading through the detailed report.
So a linkage fee is really a term that some communities are using when it's more like an impact fee. Okay. So right now we have an impact fee for the library based on demands that new development creates on a need for the library. And same with parks and schools. So the linkage fee is somewhat similar to that. So you tear down a affordable single-family home, for example, and you're putting up 3 or 4 townhomes. You would have to develop a formula where there's a modest fee that the developer would pay on a per-unit basis that would go into the trust fund. The connection to the CPI was whatever fee we come up with. We'd recommend that it be annually adjusted, say January 1st, with the prior year's CPI so that it stayed current.
But the fee would be a one-time fee.
Be a one-time fee, yes. And less than way less than the $75,000 fee that we're talking about for larger developments is the thinking.
Okay. And just in terms of, as I understand it, on the recommendations, the focus is on new developments as opposed to something like what's happening at Arlington Gardens where you have, a pretty sizable apartment complex that's undergoing complete renovation. So that would be a different conversation. We're not going to, you recommend holding off on that?
We recommended separating that because a renovation development gets fairly complex. At what level of renovation does it trigger in? What data do you need to demonstrate that they were affordable in the first place? And then obviously we want the property owners to maintain their property, so we don't want to create something that precludes or prevents or discourages somebody from maintaining their development. So that's a little more tricky. So we thought, let's deal with the guidelines that we have and address that, and then we can always come back and revisit.
Okay. That makes sense. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, because I wouldn't want to, especially have a developer think they don't have to do anything with their place after 25 years. It's going to be, and when things are lived in, they get lived in, whether it's something you own or it's an apartment or whatever. I have a question about with the trust fund revenue. When we designed it, we anticipated or hoped to have gaming revenue added, as a source of revenue for that. Does that does sports gambling, when that goes into effect, is that something that will create a revenue stream that we can tap into? Or is that different than slots and stuff?
No, it will not.
Okay. Let's see. I have one other question that I think really for you, Nora, probably when just as I was reading through the big report and all the things that have happened over the year, I didn't realize the Wright House had gotten sold. So
Yes, it did. It was just a couple of years ago. It
Yeah.
might have said in the report one.
yeah, you mentioned that in the report. So is it to just a private owner, or
Yes.
so that it's no longer the type of housing that it was, the
Right,
temporary?
that's correct. It's just
Okay.
a market rate apartment building now.
Oh, okay. I was involved in that in the early stages, so it's kind of sad. I hadn't heard that. This is really, really meaty as a whole. The recommendations. One of the things I thought was kind of interesting on the development size application part, that the staff's recommendation is for to start it at a smaller number, and the Housing Commission was willing to go to 9 or fewer. So I don't know if the discussion on that part of it.
I think from the Housing Commission side, it had mainly to do with if the development is 9 or fewer units, realistically, economically, is it reasonable to expect units be provided, or that size of a fee could be absorbed into the development. So that was just their reason, their thought on what was more economically reasonable.
And just one other comment for right now, because I want to hear from everybody else too, and that is the guidelines versus ordinance discussion. And it seems to me that an ordinance would be a cleaner or easier to apply process, but definitely just as we allow for land use variations and so on, we would have something. I would agree with having something in there that does allow for various circumstances, discussion and so on. So that's where I stand on that particular issue. So, but I'd like to hear from others too.
Okay, Trustee Tinaglia.
Thanks. Just a couple really quick questions. My head is spinning on this one. There is, for those of you who don't know, my business that I do every day, I'm not an owner. I'm not a developer. I'm an architect. I draw buildings. I design buildings for a career. And 3 of the buildings that you list on here are buildings that I designed. Timber Court, Parkview, and Arlington 425. And I sat on the other side of the table with my clients and their financial advisors, and I can tell you that, and Charles knows this because he sat with us many times, this is really hard stuff. It's really difficult to make the mathematics work. And everybody agrees that it's important. I think the toughest of my clients all still want to help, want to make something happen, but it just needs to work. So this is a lot of work to do, and thanks for putting it together. A couple of quick questions. You mentioned 6 out of 284. That's 6 communities in Illinois out of 284 that have something like this. Is that correct?
We're all defined, formalized, either ordinance or guideline, yes. That doesn't mean there aren't some other communities have asked for and received affordable units, but
Yeah.
we haven't found anything that's formalized.
Okay. And so then my next question was going to be, of those 6, are they guidelines or are they policies? Are they ordinances? Do we know the answer of those 6?
All the other 5 are ordinances, with the
They're
exception
ordinances.
of Arlington Heights.
We're the only one that just is called a guidelines
Of those 6.
of those 6.
Right. There are other communities, as Charles was saying, who make these requests but don't have even a formally written guidelines.
Okay, good. Well, it is very confusing and difficult to work with something that's not really an ordinance. It's more just a guideline or a policy. It makes it hard for everyone at the table to get their arms around what they have to do. So I would be in favor for sure of making this something that is more specific and I don't know, documented in a way that's not just a set of guidelines. So I'm glad to hear that. It is unfortunate though that there's only 6, and we're one of them. It does make it hard. It makes it hard for folks who come here and want to do good things. And as you saw in the survey, all of the different reasons why they don't like it, the cost, the taxes. So then it leads me to my last real question here, and these are just questions that I had. When the state says 10% minimum is what they would like to see, and did I get that right? That was what the one slide said, right? And then the same section, your report showed that according to their calculations, not including association dues, we're at 19.1%. We're nearly doubled what the state is requesting. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And up to today, or in the immediate future, we've been asking for 15% affordable on new developments.
10 to 15, it depends on the size of the development.
Right. Well, do we want to be that strong? Do we need to be that big? I guess those are questions rolling around in my head. I like some of the numbers that you guys came up with here on this proposal where you talk about it being 0. I think the Housing Commission said 0 for 9 or fewer. And then the 7.5%. I think you used Arlington 425 as your guidelines for those calculations. Is that correct?
Yes, for the market rate downtown
The tier
tier,
one.
yes.
The tier 1, 7.5%. And because that's what you were able to navigate and negotiate with that developer for that project, and everyone eventually agreed that that was a reasonable compromise.
Yes, that's correct. And also looking at their market rate rents, what the affordable rents would be at 60% AMI, and knowing what the lost revenue differential would be on a unit by unit basis. That's why we made that recommendation. That's why we're recommending not having the 15%, so it doesn't set out false expectations from the community that would like to see more, but we know that 15%, we've never got anywhere close to it, and I'd be surprised if a developer of a market rate development would be able to come close to that.
I think that's accurate. So then the only other thing I was going to ask about was I think I recall a lot of dialogue at 425 that had to do with the 60% of the mean area income versus a higher number at 70% or 75 or 80%. And did one of your slides, number 3, talk about low income at 60% and moderate at 80%? Slide 3.
That's correct.
So I probably didn't catch it ever somewhere else in your report here. What are you guys going to propose it at?
For rental buildings, 60% of area median income, not changing that.
And tell me why that is when we look at that as it's qualified here as low income as opposed to moderate income. Why wouldn't we move it to 70 or 75 or 80?
There are other studies that we have that show that as far as lack of affordable rental units is concerned, that it's at a lower income range that the units are lacking. That in the 80 to 100% of area median income, there are rental units available in Arlington Heights that are affordable to people in that income range. It's at the lower level that the units are lacking. The 60 and 80% is also the levels that the state of Illinois uses. It's common to use 60% for rental and 80% for owner as well, because renters tend to be lower income than homeowners are.
Okay. And I would only argue, and I'm not arguing, my point on this would be that it's probably easier to get to 60% on a building or a unit that's 20 years old. It's really hard on a brand new building that's going to get taxed at brand new tax rates and construction costs and building codes that we're going to hear all about from Steve Tulumus real soon here, that end up making these buildings cost so much money. What I hear every day from my clients is that material costs are going through the ceiling, taxes are through the ceiling. Everything that they build is, twice as much as it used to be 10 years ago. And on new construction, to keep it at 60%, the low income number here, I would think that we're making it harder than it has to be for those. And maybe there's a way to navigate that on older buildings that have been around a certain amount of time. Maybe those are the 60%ers, and that the brand new stuff is not, just because it's so hard to get to. If one of my clients were in the room here right now, I know they'd be jumping up and down saying that's exactly correct. But that's my perspective, and that's all I have for now.
Okay, thanks, Jim. Trustee Canty.
So, thank you guys so much. I know we've talked about this a lot, and I've met with you guys and emailed you, so thank you for putting up with me. I have a few questions for you, and maybe they're going to have to be directed somewhere else, but it's coming out of some of the documents that were in the agenda tonight, so that motion from the Housing Commission. So item number 7, and Charles, you had talked about this, the parking requirement waiver, right, as an option for an offset. So we talk about parking so much that it makes my ears want to bleed. So what are we even suggesting here? Are we suggesting that we would waive all parking requirements, or just for the units that you provide at an affordable rate?
So yes, the concept is to consider just those units that are affordable in the downtown. So I forget what Arlington 425 was. I think 18 units were to be provided.
In mortar, yeah.
And the developer, they're charging $125 per month for each parking space on the market rate units. Those spaces probably cost $35,000 to $45,000 per space to build. So to try to, encourage units in the development, if we have available parking overnight, and it would have to be proved up on a case-by-case basis, and when we have the parking guidance system, we'll know exactly how many people are parking at night, to then just provide 18 permits at $15 per month for those unit or owners or renters that are renting the affordable units. So the developer could reduce their parking a little bit, and the renter of the unit can get affordable parking as opposed to having to pay quite a bit for parking.
But if the parking wasn't available, then that renter would be out of luck to park?
Then it would go back to what we ended up negotiating with Arlington 425, that they provide the parking. They were asked to evaluate providing it to those unit owners on a reduced rate, and they said they would evaluate that. So we'd be back in that situation if there wasn't available parking.
Okay. Even after the building is constructed? Because I guess I'm trying to figure out, when does this come into play? Or would it come into play? And am I too far down in the weeds? You can say yes.
No, this is good. They're all good questions. We hadn't, to be honest with you, hadn't thought about that.
Okay.
Would it be available retroactively to Arlington 425? Possibly. What about other developments downtown that have affordable rents? There would come a point where, we just couldn't provide anymore because there's only so much parking we have in the garage. So it would always be based on availability of parking.
At the time that you
that we make a commitment, yes.
Okay. And then the waiver of the village permit and review fees, right? You had talked a little bit about that. But if we're going to have a guideline that says you're required to do X, Y, and Z thing or provide these units, right? Are we saying on top of that you get a waiver? Or are we saying that after we get past the table stakes, after you've done what you're required as our minimum, then we can talk about fee waivers and whatever else have you after you've exceeded that?
We haven't determined that ourselves either, so it's another good question. Again, the concern is in making sure that percentage is not too high that it puts off developers. We've already heard from some developers that probably even what we're proposing is too much for them. So we're looking at ways to incentivize that, to make it happen. So I think our initial thought was those incentives would be available if they provide that percentage of units in their development. We're not talking about waiving all of the permit fees. It would be some proportional basis.
Right. I think that's what I'm trying to work through in my head. What is the proportion based on, right? And it's okay if we haven't gotten there yet, but I just want to understand what I'm...
Yeah, we haven't got there yet either. So it could be at a minimum level on a average unit by unit basis proportionally, or it could be higher. If you provide 5% of the units in a development, you could get 25% across the board, fee reduction. And we have to test that out a little bit more on some other developments, and we need to know what we're giving up and how it impacts our budget. So
Right, sure.
we haven't done a lot of these. We don't have all the answers for, because
Okay.
if the board says no, we don't want to consider that. We didn't want to waste our time.
Sure, and that makes sense. And then the last kind of broad, or in my opinion, broad thing that I want to go over is item number 8, the alternative contributions. So I'm sure you can guess that my stomach jumped right into my throat when I read that, this idea that instead of having integrated affordable housing in our units, we might select somewhere else at a place to be determined. And that's where people who have a low income housing requirement need would then get to live because it is cheaper and it's better to do that. Right? That's how it hit me. And maybe that's not how it was intended. So I'd like to understand that because it hit me wrong.
So some communities do allow this, and I don't know all the details on how they allow it. We did have a general discussion about this with the developer who owned another piece of property, and the way it wasn't meant that way that you described it. The way it was put to us was they could build a building cheaper in a different location and even provide more units perhaps than they can in for example, in a downtown setting where you've got high-rise standards and construction costs are more expensive. So that was the general discussion. The intent isn't to put people in silos in different areas. That wasn't the intent.
But are we thinking about the actual impact in that way? Because it may not be the intent, but that could very much be the practical result.
If I could
Yeah.
jump in. I think this was identified as a possibility.
Yeah.
And this would always be looked at. This wouldn't be an automatic where either you provide X number of units or you go to, option B. This would be something that someone could get a waiver on their automatic requirements if they came up with an alternative contribution that was acceptable to the village.
Okay, so,
It-
okay.
What Charles was saying, I think, is important. Is we learned if you have someone that's building a very high end, luxury product, the economics of them providing affordable units is very different than if someone is providing, a more typical product. And so it may be better for them to, buy another piece of property somewhere in the vicinity or wherever. But I think we would be able to put whatever qualifiers on saying no to that as a village as we so chose. If it had some other type of negative impact on the community, then, that could be a deal breaker for us.
Okay. All right, those are my questions for this evening. Thank you.
Trustee Rosenberg.
Thank you, Mayor. So, Charles, I think one of the crucial things that we need to keep in mind is, obviously we're trying to be developer business friendly at the same time, create the affordability of the housing. And as we saw with Block 425, we ran into a lot of issues as far as with the developer and their, blowback, so to say, from their financiers and their financial people on, what they could allow under their formulas to get their financing and still create, the numbers to provide the affordable housing too. So I think that's crucial that we need to do that and not forget about that. A question that I have, as far as the housing trust, when it was originally formed, I guess, what was the original purpose and how was that to be used?
The purpose is, and it's as stated in the ordinance, was very general in terms of but it included either creating or preserving or both affordable housing. And it may not be explicitly stated in the ordinance, but I know the task force talked extensively about, abiding by the goal of creating housing that would be permanently affordable.
So, I guess at what level are we going to need to see that trust fund reach before we decide how it's to be used and where? Does it have to be 700,000? Does it have to be $1 million? Are we going to go and buy a building in conjunction with a developer and then create affordable housing in that building? Or, have they talked at all about what's the objective or the future goal of that?
Not yet. They did talk at one point about wanting to see 500,000 as a number before they got very specific. I think the Housing Commission could be asked at any time to look into proposing more specific goals for the trust fund.
Because ideally, within probably the next year or two, that it'll reach
number.
that level or greater.
Correct.
Have you seen anywhere where a trust fund like that has been used to subsidize people's affordable housing in any way, where they almost get like a chit every month, so to say, and against their rent?
I haven't seen that. I have seen down payment assistance to low and moderate income buyers. A number of communities are using their trust fund money to purchase more modest housing, rehab it, and then sell it to low and moderate income buyers to be then resold to low and moderate income buyers in the future.
If I could comment on that, I mean, it's been discussed in the past, and one of the concerns with that concept programmatically is if you use it on helping people with kind of rent assistance, eventually when we're built out as a community, that money will be gone. And then there will be no further rent assistance available, versus if you invest in or help create something that provides affordable housing in perpetuity, then you've helped chip away at the problem on a more permanent basis. And like I said, we can do at the end of the day whatever the board is comfortable with, but that would be an argument against that. We do provide rent assistance as part of our general assistance program that we have out of the Health and Human Services Department, but that program, for the same reason, is geared on short-term rental assistance, where people can apply for that and get it, perhaps if they were recently divorced, lost their job, or became disabled, some kind of life circumstance that made them temporarily unable to meet their requirements. So there's a lot of factors. I think there's a lot of discussion that'll have to go on this before we come to a resolution, but that's one area of concern for providing just straight up rent assistance.
So we would be the Chip and Joanna Gaines house flippers here and things like that.
Well, the other thing I'd suggest is that we don't get into the housing management business, so we would be looking to partner with other agencies or affordable housing developers that do that, and would have to have the right covenants that run with the land if we were to buy some land, or we would provide some gap financing towards a development. I don't think the village would want to be in the mission of buying and rehabbing and selling homes.
I agree. As far as that example you gave where a developer had approached you as far as converting an office to a residential, is it possible that in what we're doing here, can we fill that gap, so to say, by creating something in the guideline ordinance, whatever we decide to cover that also?
If it was an ordinance, the board definitely could. If it's a guideline, it's a lot harder, because the guideline only gets implemented when somebody's come into the village seeking approval of something. So if it's allowed as of right, and there's no zoning changes, no zoning variations, they meet setbacks, parking, everything, which that particular example did, then the guideline wouldn't apply. It would have to be an ordinance. And if it's an ordinance, it's very easy to incorporate that.
Okay, I think it's if that's the case, then, and if there's any other examples, we should look at that as more of an ordinance than to take care of that. I didn't realize that we had properties that would qualify both as commercial and residential at the same time.
There's probably not many, and in many years, that's probably the only case that's come about, but there could be some others.
Okay, thank you.
Trustee Schwingbeck.
Thank you. Nora, Charles, great job putting it together. You guys and staff and the Housing Commission commended for a nice report. I had one question and then a comment. On page 6, did I hear you say, and I didn't do the math, that 28% of the population of Arlington Heights falls in that moderate income and below?
It was 28% is spending 30% or more of their income for housing.
Okay. And then I guess my comment is, I don't have any issue making it an ordinance. And I do think it needs, there needs to be something in there for negotiation. But looking at just some of the math in these tables, I like to keep things nice and simple when you're going in and looking at code and when builders are doing projects. Sometimes when you go through our ordinances, it's complicated. Did you give any thought about not having tier 1, tier 2, just keeping it very simple and setting percentages and dollar amounts without having this set up where you've got one set of rules for downtown, another set of rules for community-wide?
So it probably looks in this format a little more complicated than it really would be. So we did talk about just one application across the board, but our concern was especially developments that get public assistance. How we felt that should have a high percentage. I'm not so sure that we could get 7.5% outside of downtown, because those are usually lower densities. The rents aren't perhaps quite as high as they might be able to get downtown. Which the downtown developers will argue they're losing more money, but they're getting more revenue. So that was the reason why we came up with the 3-tier, but we are simplifying from the approach that we have now, because right now there's 3 tiers of 5 or less, there's 0 requirement, and then there's 6 to 25, that's 10%, and then there's 26 and above, that's 15%. So we're kind of getting rid of that. So there'll be, when we lay it out in a format, it'll hopefully be simpler, so there isn't this uncertainty.
Well, and I know on one of your tables, I think it was on where you were listing all the different properties and what the individual developers did. I don't have the page marked here. Where you talked about they did cash in lieu at 25,000.
Right here.
Right there. I think you want to make it where if you're going to have 5% of the units be affordable, you want it to be a nice even number. Because if you look down at the Sigwalt where they paid cash in lieu and it came up, 1.6 units, it would be nice if we're talking about 10 or more units, we set a percentage that equals 1 unit, that it doesn't come up at 0.5 or 0.6. I think we should just make sure that the math is consistent, where there's some definite rules set there, and then we don't immediately go to a conversation where we have to negotiate.
So
If I'm making sense.
Yep, absolutely. So most communities in their ordinance that we've looked at, if units are provided,
Right.
then the rounding is typical math rounding, 1.52 and above, it's rounded to 2. When they collect a fee, it's typically, and some of the communities have higher fees than we do, correct me if I'm wrong, but some of them have, the actual number, 1.6 times, the fee number. And so, ours is silent on that. So in the Sigwalt 16, to try to get that number,
Right.
That was the approach we took, because their original proposal was 25,000 a unit. So I think if it is an ordinance, that would have to be clear in the ordinance under what scenario are we using rounding versus
Right.
the fraction.
And would a project like over by Mariano's, I'm assuming that would be in the community-wide versus the downtown?
That would be in the public assistance category, because that development has received, the first phase received some TIF funds.
I guess I'm not talking about the particular project, just
Okay.
the location.
Oh, correct,
So
yes,
that would be considered community-wide, not downtown.
that's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Trustee Padovani.
First, I'd like to thank our staff and our Housing Commission and geez, everybody who's given all their input about this really important subject, affordable housing. And I have to say, personally, I'm very proud to be in a town, one of only 6 in the out of 200 and some odd, that actually are addressing this and trying to do something to help our families and our individuals live here in this wonderful town. I've just got a couple quick questions and then one of more of a procedural. When it comes to the preferences, the local preferences, I see the term veterans used there, but the other preferences speak to Arlington Heights residents and employees. Veterans only in Arlington Heights or from anywhere?
I think when we discussed that with Arlington Downs and also Arlington 425, it was open-ended. So it was not Arlington Heights veterans, it was any veteran.
Okay. And then when I look over at the Housing Commission's recommendations, persons with disabilities, would that also be open? Or is that one of those that has to be discussed?
That's probably something that has to be discussed, I think. I mean, this would be, a developer has 10 units, for example, that are affordable, and then, if they were in a situation where there was a wait list, then they would go through that preference ranking. Obviously, they're not going to keep a unit open when they can rent it if there's no wait list. So it would only really come into play if there were, initially probably, when the building was being first occupied, and then at any time after that, if there was a wait list, they would provide preference, or if there was one unit and they had 2 applicants, then they would use the preference. So the question would be, it's really a question of the village board, whether the board's preference would be for Arlington Heights or more open-ended.
So as part of this, I think I'm hearing that we're leaning towards an ordinance here that we need to spell that out as well. Veterans, people with disabilities, whether they be only Arlington residents or open to others. Because that's what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay. And maybe it's a procedural question for Mayor Hayes here is, as I go through these columns of recommendations from the staff and from the housing commissions, there's some on the staff side that I'm preferring and some on the housing commission that I'm leaning towards, like on this local preferences, the including persons with disabilities it would be very important. And I'm not sure what long-term current residents would mean. That I guess that'd have to be defined. But in other cases, I'd lean towards what the staff is saying, or maybe a blend. So how do we give that guidance?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I do intend to take audience comment tonight. So I think that's the next step. But in terms of, that's a good question, and I was going to ask the same question. I know the suggested motion before us tonight is for the staff to go back and prepare detailed criteria for each element for further review and discussion at a future meeting. So I assume that you're going to take the direction we've given so far tonight, and I think we can come to some consensus on a number of the items, as you've already heard tonight. The guidelines versus criteria, the do away with the 15% and adopt a tiered approach, and then have to decide at a future meeting what those numbers are going to be within the tiers. But I think we can at least come to some consensus on a lot of these items tonight. And then you're going to come back, Randy or Charles, you want to explain that?
Yes, I mean, if there's something on this list that, absolutely, there's a consensus of the board don't want us to, vet out, then let us know. If, if you're comfortable with, what's on here, we can draft an ordinance, and we can start defining some of these specifics, such as what is long-term resident, should people with disabilities should be Arlington Heights residents or not. We'll come back with you, and then you'll have the framework of an ordinance, and you can make that decision. I don't think we're expecting you to get into those details tonight, but more big picture, if you want to stick with the 15%, we'd like to know now. If you're comfortable moving off that and going to a tiered approach, we'd like to know that.
Yeah, I think you've gotten a lot of good comments on that so far. So why don't we go to the audience? If there's anyone in the audience that wishes to address the board on this agenda item, we would take those comments now, and you're limited to 3 minutes. So anybody in the audience? Why don't you come forward, Peg? And just give us your name for the record, and you're reminded of the 3-minute time limit.
Peg Lane. A lot of energy tonight and in the past year has been focused on developers' wishes and opinions, but what kind of input from potential users was sought? What kind of affordable housing advocates were sought for their opinion? 13 very powerful developers were giving a lot of input here, but what about the potential occupants?
Well, all meetings were open to the public, and certainly interest groups were afforded the opportunity to provide input there, but I'll look to the staff for any additional comments on that.
Yeah, so the survey we did was not just for-profit developers. In fact, 7 out of the 13 were non-profit developers, affordable housing developers. They may be for-profit, but they focus solely on affordable housing. Senior housing developers such as Lutheran Home, the Morins, Waverly Place, like that. So we sent that out to 23 developers, and it was split fairly evenly, half and half, to for-market developers and the type that I just described. And so we have information and their responses and some of what they said when we had meetings or emails or phone conversations. So that was all part of the intake process. I'm sure the residents would like to see more affordable housing. We know that. It's hard to reach out to an affordable resident that might be looking to rent in Arlington Heights.
Take that, if I could, I can answer that a little bit further. And then the other thing to point out is that Nora Boyer, who's here, is our housing plan, excuse me. She's the administrator of our community development block grant program, so she works closely with all of the agencies that work with various populations of people that are in need of affordable housing. The village itself, our Health and Human Services Department, we work directly with folks that are in need of affordable housing. And so through our experiences, through our education, through our backgrounds, and through just our daily work, we're exposed to a lot of these stories, and that's why some of these needs have been identified. It's no decisions have been made yet, but I think it's important to note that, but for private sector investment, buildings won't come. And so it is a necessary component, and none of us have been private sector developers, and so that's why we wanted to reach out for that.
What's the need here for affordable housing? How many people are waiting for it?
How many people are waiting for it? I'm not sure if we have that information, unless you do, Nora, but in the beginning we did talk a little bit about some of the numbers that we have, if you want to jump in.
Right, we presented some of the numbers on the number of current Arlington Heights residents who are cost burdened in their housing. We've also got a Homes for a Changing Region report that gets into more detail about the income levels and the types of housing that are most needed.
Okay, yeah, I heard from John Rapp at PADS, the Journeys, the Road Home, that there were 3,400 people on a waiting list for the area. But anyway, and then I had one more question. Separate on the edge of town is not equal. What can we do to be creative in buildings so that there are some smaller, plainer if necessary, or apartments for people who meet the criteria?
I think a lot of these questions don't have answers yet, and in many ways this is the beginning of the conversation, not the end. And I think that we're going to have to think out of the box, and the nice thing that this community will have is the luxury of having this housing fund where we can think a little bit creatively and try to think of some solutions. And but I mean, I don't think we claim to have answers to all these questions yet. We're just getting started.
And I just wanted to say, is it Greg, that I'm so proud of my town for thinking about these things and trying to meet the needs of everybody. So thanks for your work.
All right, thank you, Peg. Anybody else? All right, come forward, sir. And just give us your name if you would.
Calvin Flinthall. You know, we was talking about numbers and the 60%, I'm talking to these gentlemen now, since they was addressing this, and the 60% of the AMI, right? Well, when you look at the 60% and you cut it in half, you got 3,700. And the higher number that's 50-50. Now, a lot of people can't afford the 60%. And like I was looking at the scale up there, it was you all went up is 30%. That would be best. If anything, it'd be for affordable housing, because a lot of people, when they're getting their disability income, they anywhere from $770 to maybe $1,200, and then you got the veterans that may get $3,200, you know, at times. But we're still looking at that 50% lower one, and that's the 30%. And then there's new people, like how Peg was saying, that's coming into the community that's looking for a better and disabled people, basically, and they're looking for something that's affordable. So that's what I'm looking at. You know, that it's going to be actual affordable housing in that particular project that's building coming up. And you know, the concern is that 60% is a little too high. You know, if you just look at it.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else? All right, seeing none.
Hi. Hello, I'm Jerry Wasserman. I do like the trustees' idea of simplifying. I kind of was commenting tier by tier, but it does make sense to kind of simplify it. Highland Park simplified it, Evanston simplified it. It's pretty much, 10% private developments, 20% government subsidized, 2 fees in lieu, 1 for downtown projects, 1 for outside of downtown. I think that would make it very clear to people. It is kind of confusing and convoluted now, and I do like that idea, maybe if that could be looked into, because other communities have done that and have done it successfully. But I do have comments tier by tier. Regarding the first tier, the recommendation is 7.5% inclusion of affordable units would be lower than the other ordinances existing in other suburbs, whereas Evanston is at 10% and Highland Park at 20%. The minimum amount should be set at 10%. The village's staff's recommendation of 5% poses a question to me, why even have an ordinance then? I feel like that's going backwards. We already had a 15% affordable policy. Why go backwards? Why not go forward? At that amount, the goal of an inclusionary ordinance would not be achieved the way it's intended. The fee in lieu for this tier should be higher than $25,000 to encourage developers to meet the maximum affordability requirements. I think the developers' responses on the survey show that they'd be willing to pay more. And I do think it's a misguided fear that developers will walk away from projects. I think it was the wishy-washiness of the previous negotiations on the Arlington 425 that caused all the problems. I think if developers go in with a nice, clear ordinance, they'd be willing, they know what they're getting into, and they'd be more willing to agree to it. So I don't really understand. I think Arlington Heights is very attracted to developers. They know that. I mean, it's a very prosperous suburb. It's a bustling downtown. So I don't really, understand that fear that keeps being talked about. And if that's just based on the Arlington 425 project that you mentioned, I think there's some other things that should be looked into in addition to that. Regarding the second tier, I'd like to ask, is there more available land space downtown versus outside of downtown? You know, because that tier, you know, at 5%, I think that should also be higher at 10%. There may be down the road more available land space outside, you know, the downtown, maybe overbuilt or close to being, you know, built up at this time. So outside, is there, like, how does that figure out? Is there going to be in the future more developments outside of downtown versus the downtown? Does anyone know that answer?
Yeah, there'll be more potential development outside of downtown than there will be downtown. There's no question about that, based on some of the redevelopment plans and discussions that we've had with developers. We have had 2 developers that have not moved forward with their projects, and you know, I'm not even sure one of them would move forward with what we've proposed. But so that is, you know, that is the concern, that we're trying to, you know, be pro affordable housing, but you know, with the right balance. So that's why there's a higher percentage for public assistance. So if we have a area that has a TIF district, or there's low income tax credits, or some other public financing, there should be more units in that kind of development. So that was the reason for, you know, the approach that we took. We just we see development going on in other towns that don't have this requirement, Mount Prospect, for example, and I'm a little concerned about that. So we just need to keep that in mind and keep the right balance.
Okay, thank you.
Right, I think it would just be easier if it was 10% for both, I don't know.
Okay, Ms. Wasserman, I'm going to have to ask you to conclude real quick.
Okay. Then regarding the third tier, my question, why government subsidized developments are at 10%, why not 20% as the other suburbs? I would think with the subsidized funding, it would be more the reason to include a greater amount of affordable units. And I think I just want to conclude to say, well, I also like to discuss the fee in lieu. I think it should be higher, you know, across the board higher. We want to deter people from paying the fee in lieu and provide the units. So I think we could go higher across the board on the fees in lieu. I think Arlington Heights is a great opportunity here, and I do appreciate that we're even here talking about this. It's wonderful, and that we're considering an ordinance, which I think is necessary. You've done great work putting it all together, and I think Arlington Heights is a great opportunity here to do a great thing and set an example for the surrounding communities, and to make it, you know, a little stronger of a policy than 5%. I think, you know, 7.5% at the least, and 10% is, you know, would match what the other ordinances are doing and have been successful at doing. So thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else? Mr. Moons.
Good evening, all. Thank you. I just want to just comment on a couple of things. There's 2 things that really stood out in today's discussion. There was a chart on one of the memos, I think, sent out by the Housing Commission or the Planning Department here. It was a projected demand for housing in 2040. And these are people that are making under $50,000, and that projected demand for housing for people under $50,000 by 2040 is going to increase substantially. So there's going to be a huge demand here for people that are making under $50,000 for housing by 2040. The other one was that the number of households in town right now that are trying to get by with greater than 30% of their income for housing, which I thought was around 28%, is a big number. And so that's going to go up as well. So I would ask that you look forward here to who our residents are going to be. We want the units here. We need the units here. Please look to something that provides for that. I think the developers have said that they, in the graphs here tonight, 20% affordable, and they would pay higher in fee in lieu. So I don't think we need to be afraid of developers running away from Arlington Heights. They're not going to do that. In my estimation, I would ask that you put as many units as you can in this ordinance going forward. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Anybody else? All right, seeing none. Trustee Tinaglia.
Thanks, Mayor Hayes. Well, Keith, you and I have talked about this a couple times outside in the hall, and we've come to grips with a couple of thoughts. And I'm going to tell you right up straight, they will run away, and they are running away. If we make it too hard make it too expensive, make it too difficult, they will build them on Prospect. Mount Prospect wants what we have here. Everywhere else that doesn't make it as difficult is where they'll choose to go. So we have to figure out a good balance. And so my whole point is this has to be a team. I don't think that we can just dump all of this on the new developments back. This has got to be a community-wide investment that we work together, all of us in this room, with these new projects so that it can happen. How do you do that? Some sort of a rebate on your permit fees, density increases. I think you can get higher percentages of units that are affordable if we can increase the density. I've had that dialogue with clients and other prospective developers. If you're only allowed to build 80 units per the land, but you want to have another 15 in there that are affordable, okay, so maybe giving them a little extra to work with is the right way to go. And that's teamwork. That's just teamwork, us taking the bullet as well as that developer. And at the end, everybody wins. So to me, it's just a matter of finding out what the balance is. What do we want to do? What do we need? I think we need all of this as much as we can get. I think it's important. I've got young kids. I'm going to be old soon if I'm not there already. I'm going to want to take advantage of some of these things. And I'm glad you're all here talking as you do, because we need to do this. We just can't make it so difficult that it doesn't get done. And that's all I'm asking.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay. Do we have enough direction, or do you need more from us tonight?
I think we're good. We can. I'm not hearing anything on either staff or the Housing Commission recommendation that the board doesn't want or like. There's a couple of differences, and we'll work up a couple of things either way and bring it back.
The other thing I'll say is there were a number of questions identified that we now understand we need to refine further, and so that's been helpful for us as well.
And there will be other things that we're exploring that'll be more in the nitty-gritty, like unit sizes and things like that. Do they have to be equal? Right now they do, but in many communities they don't have to be equal. And again, it makes it more palatable for a developer to provide the units if they don't have to be quite as large. They're still going to have the same common amenities and things like that. So there's other things that we will bring back in a draft ordinance besides just the big issues that we've talked about here.
Okay, Trustee LaBedz.
Thank you. Would it be possible to get some additional information about the affordable housing that's provided in the other 5 communities, more specific than what was in the report in terms of numbers, locations, sizes of units, and even a comparison of population of need versus what is supplied, that sort of thing. Because they're all, Evanston's probably somewhat close in population size to us, but the others are definitely smaller. So I'd be interested in knowing what we're comparing ourselves with.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And they're all, many of them have higher median household value as well, so that therefore their fee is higher. So Highland Park and
That's
Lake Forest, for example. So yes, I
important
understand
point.
where the type of information you're looking for. So we'll work
Okay.
on that.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay. Do we need a motion?
I don't think so. I think that the discussion is providing enough feedback to the staff that we can proceed, and we'll proceed in the refinement of these recommendations and bring them back at a later date.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you, Charles and Nora.